community when you're out of action.
Okay, I guess we should start. It's already kind of a bit late. Okay, so I rushed through the last part of chapter 2 on Tuesday. So I just want to summarize it just very, very briefly. And that is that we said that even for the lighter sins, in order to repair the relationship, one had to fast a whole lot of fasts. And we gave examples of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Huna, each of whom committed what many of us wouldn't be even considered to be a sin. You know, it's very, very slight. And nevertheless, it says that Hushru Shinov B'mnei Tainis, that their teeth became black as a result of the fasting. In the last case, he fasted 40 fasts. And what is all this about? It's certainly not to avert terrible punishments from above, because we've already established that punishments from above are, number one, are meant to be brought by God and not by yourself. And number two, those punishments only come in the case of capital or very serious sins, for which the punishment may be being cut off from the people, not from light things such as these. So why did they in fact fast? So we said the reason for those fasts were appeasement. In other words, repairing the relationship which had been damaged as a result of sin. So the person had already done tshuva. Tshuva is now complete. He's turned over a new leaf. He's not going to do it anymore. It's a perfect tshuva, because he's expressed also regret for what he's done and confessed what he's done. Hashem has forgiven him, but nevertheless, the relationship remains blemished, shall we say. It's not perfect. So now what he has to do is he has to repair the relationship. Now this repairing of the relationship is what is achieved by all these fasts. And the damage to the relationship occurs even for slight sins, because they're all part of the divine will. And even for slight sin, we somewhat damage our relationship with Hashem, okay? So, we repair that through fasting, through why? Well, originally it was meant to be repaired through bringing a korban. What is the significance of a korban? The korban is that whatever's happening to the animal, as I explained briefly last week, the Ramban says we're supposed to have this kind of catharsis. It's happening to ourselves. So when you're bringing a korban, you can't just bring the korban and say, oh, here, Hashem, take a korban, I'm forgiven. This is not like the fellow who goes into the confessional and says to the priest, okay, here, I just confessed it, now I can go on. No, that's not what it's about. It's rather about an entire catharsis, that you see that really you deserve what's happening to the animal should happen to you. Its blood is being spilled and sprinkled on the altar. Your blood should be spilled, really. Its fats are being brought on the altar. Your fats should be brought on the altar. So you're undergoing an entire catharsis. You prioritize yourself over God. So now you want to say you're ready to give up your life, so to speak, for God. And you're doing that, so to speak, through the act of bringing a korban. Okay. Now, we can't bring korbanis anymore. So what happens now? So the Alter Rebbe explained that the Arizal taught his Talmidim a huge amount of fasts based on even slight sins. And why did the Arizal do this? Because he based himself on the various stories of the Gemara that we read yesterday about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Huna, all of whom fasted a myriad of fasts, even slight sins. So therefore the Arizal said, well, according to Kabbalah, you have to fast such and such a many amount of fasts for this sin, such and such a many fasts for this sin, such and such a many fasts for this sin, etc., etc. Okay? Then I mentioned briefly what the significance of some of these numbers are. Okay, so it says, for example, on anger, you're supposed to be able to fast 151 fasts. And why is that? Because if you add up the gematria of Chof, Ayin, Samach, which is the numerical value of the Kas, you're going to come up with 150. Chof is 20, Ayin is 70, Samach is 60, adds up to 150. What's 151? Very often in gematria, we add the value of the words, you get 151. What happens if you drink stam yenom, you drink wine which has been touched by a Gentile? So it's not a Torah prohibition, it's only a rabbinic prohibition, because according to Torah, it's only forbidden if it was actually used as a libation to our idol. Not used for a libation to idol, it's not Torah forbidden, but it's still rabbinically forbidden. We call it stam yenom. So in that case, yayin is yud 10 plus nun is 50 70. He says you have 73. So the Arizal said you have to count also the letters of the word, 73. Finally, he said when it comes to a davening, if you didn't have proper kavanah when you were davening, then what happens over there is you're supposed to be able to fast 61 fasts. What's 61 fasts? So he says that's the gematria of ani, and Kabbalistically speaking, ani is associated with davening. We don't have to go into that right now. Okay. So through fasting, we essentially achieve the same thing that we would normally achieve through bringing a korban. Okay. Why is that? So we explained that the reason for that is because the famous, I think it was Reb Sheshes, I quoted last week, it's in Gemara and Brochis, that he asked that the lessening of his own fat as a result of his own blood should be like a korban as well. Okay, good. Now you fast, and and does that actually achieve it just by fasting? Is fasting enough alone enough? So if you read the last line again of what we had in chapter 2, it says there, as is written in the book of Isaiah, he criticizes the Jewish people for not fasting appropriately, and he says, do you want to call this a fast? You want to call what you're doing now an act of appeasement? So the Alter Rebbe says, what he means to say is that the way you've done it now is not an act of appeasement. Miklal, however, Shatzeina Nirza, had you done it properly, had you fasted properly, Hu Yom Rotzin, it would be in fact an act of appeasement and a day of appeasement. Now, so what's a good fast and what's a bad fast? That obviously begs the question now. We're going to figure out what's a good fast, what's a bad fast. So there's a few very cute kind of, one of a better word, Hasidic sayings which actually explain the significance of a bad fast. So one of the famous stories is that a person comes to Simcha Bunim of Pshischa, one of the famous Hasidic Rebbes, Predish Hasidic Rebbes, and he says, look, I saw it says in the books, in the holy books, I saw it said that if you fast a certain amount of fast, you're going to see Eliyahu Hanavi. So he said, well, I actually did that. I fast all of these fasts and I didn't see Eliyahu Hanavi. How come I haven't seen Eliyahu Hanavi? So the Pshischa says to him, he says, you know what? You know the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, that he used to go on a wagon on Motzei Shabbos, and he used to travel very, very far, and there was a kind of kritzas haderech, and the road, so to speak, skipped underneath them. They went through this kind of contraction of space. Einstein would have been proud, right? And they arrived at a very, very distant place in a matter of moments. So he says, what do you think the horses were thinking at the time? Right? The horses were thinking at the time, listen, normally speaking, as they're flying through the air and they're passing very quickly past the various taverns, because normally speaking, whenever you came to a tavern, the horses would be set out to have some hay and have a drink. And as they can see the taverns flying underneath them, what do you think they're thinking? They're thinking, wow, we don't need this anymore. We don't need the hay. We don't need the water. And they do second, again, we don't need the hay. We don't need the water. We mustn't be horses. We must be angels. And then when the Baal Shem Tov finally gets to his destination, what happens? That the horses are put into the tavern, and what do? They go straight for the hay, and they go straight for the water. And then they see that they really are horses. So the Pshitcha says like this, he says, you can fast from here to tomorrow. These horses are not eating. The fact that they're not eating doesn't mean that they've become angels. And the fact that you're fasting doesn't mean to say that you become angelic and can see Eliyahu Hanavi. It's not about the fasting, it's about what you're putting into the fast. So this is why Yeshaya says at the end of Perek chapter 2, he says it has to be a proper fast. It has to be a fast which is a catharsis. Just like we said before, when it comes to korban, why does a korban work? A korban doesn't work when you just merely bring the sheep and then you go, oh, look at me, I brought a sheep. Or like the famous Gemara speaks about, the Medrash speaks about, the guy brings a big ox and he's so proud of himself as he marches the ox in. Look at the ox I'm bringing. If he didn't undergo this catharsis, the ox is not going to be atoned for him. And if he didn't undergo the catharsis, the fast is not going to atone for him. He's going to stay the same horse as he did before. So the fast, in order to work, has to be a Yom Rotzin, has to be done, it has to be a Shema Nirutz, I'm sorry. It has to be a fast that actually is going to achieve the appeasement. I don't mention, by the way, over here, something else as well. So, a fast only works with the right intent. There's something else which also works with the right intent. Normally speaking, we say that a mitzvah, even if you don't have the kavanah for a mitzvah, you still fulfill the mitzvah. So, you ate matzah on Pesach, you didn't even know what you were doing, you still fulfill the mitzvah, all right, fine. But there are certain things that don't work so well that way. And one of them is davening. In davening, the Rebbe actually quotes, and the Rebbe says that if you daven and you have no intent at all, you're just saying the words and you're totally mindless about it, right? And it's not davening. Ain't it tefillah. You didn't do anything. You didn't do anything. So then the question is, so why daven? We have so all these machshavas. Well, hopefully, at least some of the words you're going to have intention for, right? It says, for example, saying Shemon Esrei, at least try to have intention when you say the words Baruch Atah Hashem and then the rest of them, Avram, Shield of Avram, and Baruch Atah Hashem, Chaim Mesim, who revives the dead. You can't have all the kavanah, or at least try and have kavanah, as the Shulchan Aruch says, for the first brachas. At least try to have a little bit of kavanah, and we hope that with all of the saying, at least some of it will have kavanah, right? What happens? You daven the whole davening. Well, hopefully tomorrow it'll be better. You still want to habituate yourself to davening because by saying the words, hopefully you're going to remember that you're supposed to be understanding what you're saying. So, we need to be a little bit conscious of that. At least some of the davening we daven, at least some of it, we need to have kavanah for. We can't just assume the words work. There is a kind of exception to that. When I was a little kid, and one of the shluchim were here. I was 1967. The first shluchim came to Australia, so I was very friendly then, and still am now with Rabbi Majeski. He was my counselor in camp, and I was only 13 years old. I actually was 12 years old. And I said, I don't understand what I'm davening. What's all this davening all about? What am I doing with all this stuff? I don't understand the word I'm saying. So he said, there used to be a switchboard at the back of a downstairs in Yeshiva behind the men's shul. It's actually still there, except now there's a whole cupboard around and you can't get access to it. But when we were kids, we could get access to it. And we used to muck around sometimes, turn the lights on and off, the shul lights on, and like kids would do. And so we'd have a good time. So he said, that switchboard over there, he says, you don't know what lights you're turning on and off, right? One of them, you just flick the switches. He says, you might not know what you're doing. And nevertheless, something's happening. So he said the same thing was, so you say the words of davening and something actually happens. You may not be conscious of it. However, that applies mainly, I should say, when you're actually saying psukim, when you're saying verses of the Torah. The verses of the Torah itself are very powerful. So when you say Ashrei Yesh Ve'Veisecha, for example, those words are switches. Anything it says, when you read Torah Shebiksav, when you read the written law, right, Torah Shebiksav, the actual words are considered to be the learning of Torah, even if you don't understand them. So you teach a child Torah Tzivah Lo Moshe, for example. The words are important, okay? So and they have switches. When, however, you're praying to Hashem and you're saying, Yehi Ratzon, may it be the will of Hashem, right? Or you're asking Hashem to do something. You're not just saying verses. For that to work properly, you really need to have intent. Okay, so you have Psuki de Zibra, whether you understand or not, it's working. But when you're saying Shemoneh Esrei, you got to understand what you're saying. Yes, sorry.
Can I just ask you, I thought that the advantage of davening in Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, over English was that if you don't have intent, then just the mere fact that you're saying it in Lashon HaKodesh does definitely have achieves and goes the way.
Yeah. Look, no question it does, but it depends what you're davening. Again, it depends what you're saying. And there's a difference between reading psukim and there's a difference between actually praying to Hashem. Look, I don't want to dismiss the idea that people praying to Hashem. There's a general kavanah too. The general kavanah that one can have is that, look, there's so many stories about Shem Tov this way. I don't know what I'm doing, but you understand the letters. You take these letters and you make them into the prayers. But you do have this consciousness at the very least that you're standing in front of God and you're asking for God. You may not understand the words, but you're understanding, you're talking to God. I should have said that earlier. This general kavanah, this kavanah klolis, the general kavanah, that even though I don't understand what I'm saying, but you got to understand it. I mean to be standing before you, and I'm afraid I don't understand, but you do. That is also, that general kavanah also works.
That's what they say in the shuls, Dalif namely. But that's like the general thing.
Right. But let's be honest. Sometimes we find that difficult too. Our minds wander altogether. So it doesn't matter. But just try to refocus. From time to time.
Isn't it also the Indian that, like, you're saying, what happens if you don't daven with kavanah? That the tefillahs are staying, and then one time that you do daven with kavanah, all the string of tefillahs that have been there for so many months and years will be lifted, like they're almost like empty, and then they're waiting for that infusion.
So there is definitely this idea, and it's an idea we've just spoken about in the 40 chapters of Tanya, that you can in fact later on things which you did you can actually uplift them. In fact, it says that you should be very careful on the last prayer of the year, which is Mincha of Yom Kippur, to daven properly, so that through that last Mincha of Yom you can lift up everything that you. Yeah. Let's move forward now.
So can I ask, is it better to daven in English and understand what you're saying, or to say it in Hebrew?
I definitely believe that praying in English has great value. You shouldn't stop there, but the reality is that at least saying some of it in English, if you don't understand Hebrew, definitely has value. And as time goes on, try to be able to say, look, I'm going to try to learn the first bracha and understand the first bracha. Okay, then I'm going to try and understand the second bracha and read it in Hebrew. Now, one shouldn't stay in the state of only saying in English. But the reality is, if you daven some of the davening in English, I had in my shul in Sydney, there's a very, very sincere person, an extraordinarily sincere person. He used to daven the majority of davening in English. Shemoneh Esrei he would say in Hebrew, and he taught himself the meaning of Shemoneh Esrei in its actual meaning.
Thank you.
There's a lot to say about davening in English. The problem is, of course, your mind can wander even when you're saying English, right? It's not limited to Hebrew. Perek Gimel, Chapter 3. Now, V'hinei Chochmei Musa Achreinim, the latter day sages of the ethics movement, Nechleku, they have they're divided. B'mish chotach echad pamim rabbi, someone has sinned the same sin many times. The Yeshayim shetzorach l'sanas mitzvah tzenis lo'isachad pamim rabbis k'vi ha'mitzvah shechato. Some people say that you have to fast the number of sins, the number of fasts for that sin, according to the number of fasts that you did. Kigoyin hametzi zero levatol, a person, for example, the man amidst semen and vein, shemisbeh hatzemi shemfrush b'tikun HaTeshuva me'arizal ein pei dalatanias, which is, according to Ari HaKodesh, the Holy Ari, the amount of fast you have to do is 84 fasts. V'imchota b'zeh, he sinned with this eser or esrim pomim 10 or 20 times. Al derech mashal, for example, Sarach Lasan is eser or esrim pomim sayidalad v'chein lo'olam. He will have to fast 10 or 20 fasts. 10 or 20 times 84, and so on and so on. And why is this so? This is similar to the sin offering, which a person would bring a sin offering for every time. So, for example, if you Machal Shabbos 10 times, you couldn't just get away with one sin offering, you had to bring 10 sin offerings, right? And whatever the thing was, according to the number of sins, you had to do it. So there are those who say that that's what one has to do, which is pretty harsh. And some compare this to a burnt offering, which comes as a result of not performing a positive commandment. Because in the case of a positive commandment, you do not bring a korban chatos, you do not bring a sin offering, but you should bring a korban oila, a burnt offering. And in that case, when it comes to korban oila, the feel over, I'll come and say, Miskap oila achas kedis b'gemara be'ekam b'zochim, and the Gemara says in Zvachim that even if you transgress many times, you didn't say Shema many times, etc., in the right time, you only have to bring one korban oila, and therefore, similarly, also fasting, you only have to do one time, you don't have to do many, many times. And the compromise which has been reached in this is is that one should fast 3 times the number of fasts for that particular sin. The Hainu, meaning to say, Reish Nun Beis Semis, 252 fasts. Serious stuff over here. For having a midat sim in vain. He's giving that as an example, but the same thing applies with all the other fasts and sins and transgressions.
Rabbi Maleki, with the saying Shema as in the right time, does that only apply to men?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, any mitzvah which is time dependent, with the exception of only very few, for example, eating matzah on Pesach, etc. People making kiddush on Friday night, for example, also women have to hear. But most positive commands which depend on time are a man's responsibility and not a woman's, because she has other responsibilities.
So can she say if she misses them? Someone asked me this.
Yes, absolutely.
If she misses the morning Shema, davening, can she say Shema?
Absolutely.
Time of the day?
Yeah, and a man should too, by the way.
Yeah.
You don't want to compound the thing. In other words, you didn't get the mitzvah of Shema in its time, but at least you should still say Shema. At least get the mitzvah of reading something from Torah, which is highly significant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
And what is the reason why we can make this compromise and say 3 times is enough? So it explains in the Zohar that if a person sins before God one time, he makes an impression. In other words, he makes an impression. Every sin has an impression, but it doesn't penetrate. However, Zimnut Lisoy, by the time he does the same sin 3 times, the sin is already totally and absolutely penetrated him from one side to the other, and therefore after 3, that's it. You've already totally corrupted yourself, so there's no point in doing any more because you've reached a state of total corruption anyway. So therefore, on that basis, he says, it's enough to be able to fast 3 times a sin. This is the reason why the number of fasts should also be 3 times the number which the Arizal says for every particular sin. Now, okay, that's all good and fine, right? We could be fasting a lot. So, yeah. Well, this particular one is relevant to men, but for example, if you get angry, you already had 84. So 3 times 84 is quite a lot too, 252, isn't it? Right? So, and if you, you know what? Yeah, so
Ramadan.
yeah, so you'd be spending, you'd be spending most of your time fasting, right? And of course, there were people who did this, right? They were Perushim, they did this, and they, well, as far as they're concerned, they're doing what the Arizal says. Now the Alter Rebbe, however, continues, and the Alter Rebbe says, "Ochin, however, kol zeh be'adam chazik." This only applies to a strong person, a healthy person. Shein ribi atzem is mazik leklal, who fasting so many times doesn't cause him any harm at all. Lebrius gufay, to the health of his body. Ochamoy b'deres harishenim, for example, in the first generations. Aval, however, mi sheribi hatzem is mazikli, someone who this number of fasts will hurt him. Maybe he'll get sick, or maybe he'll just have pains. Michush doesn't mean sick, but he'll just have pains. For example, in our generations, he's not allowed to fast so many fast days. Even if he did terrible things, like he did something for which the punishment is kores, or death by the hand of Beis Din, or mikolshken, how much more so should he not fast on mitzvahs to say kores, on a positive and a negative commandment which do not carry the punishment excision. Ella, but rather, according to how much you will estimate in his own self, that it certainly will not harm him at all. I'm going to continue till the end, and then we'll take questions. Because even in those earlier generations, we made Noim v'Amoraim, in the days of the Tanoim who wrote the Mishnah, Amoraim who wrote the Gemara, they would only fast these fasts that we mentioned on the previous page. We said Rav Lozer ben Azariah, and Rav Yeshua, and Rav Huna. The only ones who are allowed to fast are Briim, only healthy people. The Motzi L'Tzuru Nafshayu had the ability to cause themselves pain, but without damaging their bodies. Or Loi Motzi L'Tzuru Nafshayu, however, a person who's not able to cause himself pain without damaging his body, Umisane and he fasts, Nikra Chayte, such a person is called a sinner. The Gemara, the Perikama, the Tainis, as we find, the Gemara says in the first chapter of Tainis. And this applies to the Alter Rebbe says, Vafilu misane al averu shebayodi. Even if the person is fasting for sins that he's done and he wants to achieve atonement. And everyone, in fact, needs atonement, because there's no such thing as a person who never sins, who at least has not missed doing a mitzvah zeh which he could have done. Everyone has this problem. It says, and nevertheless, we do not tell the person he has to fast. Or mikolshkin, how much more so, mishubal Torah, someone who studies Torah and studies Torah diligently. Shechayte, he's considered to be a sinner for fasting. V'ne'nesh b'chiflayim, and he's doubly punished for fasting. Because as a result of his fasting, he's now not going to be able to study Torah, and that absence of studying Torah is causing even more problems than the fasting is meant to rectify. Because studying Torah as much as you can is itself a positive commandment, and if you diminish that or don't study to the extent you can, that itself is a serious problem. Elamaita kante. So what should he do instead? Kediksiv, as it says, redeem your sin through giving tzedakah. Or meshkosva apeiskim litten bad kol yem tanish or tshuva erechai gedeli peilish. It's like the peiskim have said, and this is actually mentioned in Shulchan Aruch, that for every day that you need to fast in order to achieve perfection, you should give 18 of these Polish coins. They're called gedeli peilish, and I'll explain to you in a minute how much that is. We are Osher Yesivli V'Oshrei, and that's the minimum you have to give for every day. And someone who's wealthy should give him more. Kamishkos Gavrom, whose Tainus is among the Rom, explains in the laws of Tainus. Okay, so it's pretty clear now that the Alter Rebbe does not want us to do all of these fasts. Becky, sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that a parak ago we were saying about the guy that his teeth blackened from fast, so he obviously harmed himself.
Sure, and here, this is exactly what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. The Alter Rebbe is saying is that even in those first generations with Noim Aroim, the people he spoke about the previous page, the only ones who were allowed to do it are those who were confident that as a result of fasting, they weren't going to damage themselves. They're going to cause themselves pain, of course, but they weren't going to damage their health. So obviously the people we spoke about in the page before were not damaging their health.
Blackened teeth is not damaging your health.
Oh, that's what you're asking, they blacken their teeth. Interesting, with blackening their teeth. That's interesting. So I would say, and this I'm saying off the top of my head, but I believe it's probably correct, and that is that you can have, your teeth may not be any good, but that's something that may not prevent you from doing mitzvahs. That may not overall harm your body, although I'm sure some people would argue with that today. I take the question on board, okay? I mean, yeah, I know that when I've got a toothache, it affects my whole body, but who knows? You know, the Rebbe didn't have any teeth, and the Frierdiker Rebbe told him he's not allowed to have any fillings in his teeth or any false teeth, right? So when you heard the Rebbe speaking of a brain and the Rebbe speaking without any teeth, And one of the remarkable things is, I think it's remarkable, that you would not know that the Rebbe was speaking without any teeth. Because when someone has false teeth, takes false teeth out, you can tell, and by the Rebbe you couldn't tell. I mean, it was just remarkable. So obviously maybe there are such people who could lose their teeth, and nevertheless it doesn't impact them. And the Rebbe was eating, don't ask me how, but he was eating. We know the Rebbe ate without teeth. Go figure. Huh?
Bit the horse radish.
I don't know what happened.
I don't-
Okay, so what have we studied now? I'm going through it relatively quickly because this is pretty straightforward stuff that the Alter Rebbe is saying over here. I'd just like to add, there's a letter from the Alter Rebbe he wrote to someone who wanted to fast. I'm just reading to you a verbatim because this is written in a book. Here the Rebbe is actually giving actual advice to a live individual. So he says, so the Alter Rebbe writes to this person, Ato hapam agala dati aktana. I want to reveal to you my small mind. The Alter Rebbe is speaking modestly. He says, I want to reveal to you my small mind. Oidis hatsemis ve'oidis agolos, concerning the fast that you're undertaking and concerning the fact that you're putting yourself in exile. You know, some people used to have this habit of atoning for their sins by going into exile. They became unknown and would wander from place to place. So the Alter Rebbe says, I want to give you my small opinion. The Alter Rebbe's small opinion is probably bigger than our biggest opinion about concerning the matter of fast. He says, Loi be'ele chafetz Hashem. This is not what Hashem desires. V'loi kikein kibalti mirabeis hakdeshim. This is not what I received from my holy teachers. Ach zeisa eitza yiutza. This is my advice to you. Lispalul besimcha gedela adin ketz. That in order to atone for your sin, daven with great, unlimited joy. So the exact opposite, right? Now just think to yourself: is this easy to daven with great, unlimited joy?
Was it better than destroying yourself and
Okay, but is it easy?
no?
So the Alter Rebbe is not letting him off the hook. The Alter Rebbe is saying, take the energy that you would lose as a result of fasting, take that energy and transform it into something good. Figure out a way of being so totally focused on your davening, so focused when you're reading Hashemayim Shemayim Lashem, that the heavens belong to Hashem, Hashemayim B'Shmei Hashemayim, read the Halukas, for example, and understand that everything about Ninim, about the whale, everything that's in nature is Hashem. Think about what you're actually saying, and as a result of that, come to a sense of true joy by looking at the universe, and while you're davening and meditating, that will give you unlimited joy. That level of focus is going to achieve the same thing as fasting, right? So again, as I said at the end of the last chapter, just fasting alone, if you're just fasting and it doesn't transform you, there's no catharsis happening when you're fasting, you don't achieve anything. So you need to have intent. And what the Alter Rebbe is saying is take that intent, and instead of putting it into fasting, put it into something really something positive like davening. Which is we'll come to that soon. But yeah, take the same thing and daven with simcha gedela. The reason I'm saying the simcha gedela is because here, this is an letter from the Alter Rebbe, and he's saying, take this thing which normally you would associate to get rid of, you have to fast. You can achieve the same thing by great joy. But again, it's something that you have to work at to have this great joy when you're davening, right? The spal b'simcha gedela in kids, to daven with great and infinite joy. Just give another example. I'll take a question in a second. Just another example of something that the Rebbe said. You know, we have this concept that you read about in Chassidus, and it's called iskafia, right? Iskafia basically means, the Alter Rebbe says earlier in Tanya, you learn Tanya before, can't remember, I think it gives the example, I think it's chapter 29 or something where it is. I hope I'm right. Anyway, whatever. So he says, for example, that you know, you normally eat breakfast at a certain hour, delay your breakfast a couple of hours, right? Delay it a couple of hours. That's kafia. Simply, of course, it means that, you know, you want to have this chocolate bar, you don't want to have the chocolate bar. Simple, all right? You don't need the chocolate bar altogether. Like, right? Like my father used to say, you know, Chassidin would say, what we don't need, we for sure don't need. Yeah? Tomanish. No, sorry. Henya, how does it go?
What you're allowed to have.
what you're not allowed to have, you for sure shouldn't have. And what you're allowed to have, you shouldn't have. Okay. So, was meg darf nicht. What you're allowed to have, then you shouldn't have anyway. So, clearly, when it comes to taivas, etc., one should, that's a skafia. So then, a bocha asked the Rebbe, no, he wants to do with kafia. So the Rebbe says, you know what the skafia today is? Skafia is when your mother puts a plate in front of you, you should eat it. In other words, I don't like this particular thing. Nah, I don't like this food. Nah, give me something else. Make me something else. When you have the food in front of you, eat what's given in front. It's healthy food. Eat it. That's the skafia. You don't have to hold yourself back. I'm not going to eat it. I'm going to delay my breakfast for 2 hours. Skip the food delay. Eat what you need to eat. Don't start thinking empty stomach, like the famous story that Tzemach Tzedek tells his daughter-in-law that that you're supposed to be able to eat to daven and not daven because you're thinking about the food. So don't delay the food, but rather eat the food, right? But eat what's in front of you. Don't think you have to delay the food. So this is a huge transformation in what the Alter Rebbe is saying over here. So now we have a big question we have to answer. And that is, if that's the case, why are we learning this in the first place? Why do we have to worry? Well, maybe the Arizal in his time they could do it, but if it's not relevant to us because we can't do it anymore, so, and even in the time of the Alter Rebbe, he says, people could, so why are we learning it? What's the purpose of all of it?
Probably a lot of people at that time who were still doing
Yeah,
it.
why is it there for us? Why are we bothering to learn it today?
Because there's still people who want to do that.
No,
I mean,
it's because
84.
There's still people who do that.
it's because we want to
Same as the Rebbe had the heart attack.
The Rebbe says that you're not only that. The Alter Rebbe says if you do it and you become a sinner, and our Rebbe tells us not to do it. And the Alter Rebbe is speaking to a person who is obviously fasting and private golus. He's going to exile, right? And the Alter Rebbe in his time is telling him, don't do it. So the Alter Rebbe is saying, no, it's a matter of, well, if you want to do it, if you don't feel you can, don't do it, don't fast. And especially our Rebbe is telling us, don't fast. We're not allowed to fast today. It's not about maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. The Rebbe is very explicit about the notion that we're not allowed to fast today. And as the Alter Rebbe says, if you fast when you shouldn't, you're called a cheta, you're called a sinner. You not only didn't achieve anything, but you became a sinner. And even at the time of the Alter Rebbe is saying, this is not what I received from my teachers. So if he didn't receive from his teachers that we should be fasting, why did he put it in the Tanya? Who's it what? Relevant to one person? This is Sefer Shel Beinanim. This is a book for the average guy. There's not a book meant for tzaddikim. There's not Sefer and Shel tzaddikim. So what's it doing over here? We have to answer this question. The Rebbe answers the question. I'll tell you what the answer is in a minute. Yeah, go on.
Yes.
Huh?
I was just going to guess.
Guess? Good
To stress the severity of doing the Avera, so we should understand this is really what would be required to rectify it. So from there you understand how
Very
serious
good.
the Avera is.
Very good.
But we're not on that level,
Very-
so we should be doing
Excellent. And that is very likely a good reason. I'm giving you an alternate reason. That's not an exclusive reason. I'm going to give you as well. Now that makes a lot of sense too. All right. So
want to repair the relationship, remember?
yeah. So I just told you how to do it. Daven with great joy. Eat the food which is in front of you. Have daven. There are other ways, and also give stock up. Right? Give stock up. You want to fix it up? Give stock. There are other ways of dealing with this thing.
When the Rebbe had the heart attack
Hmm?
in 78, and everyone was crying and upset. The Rebbe said, "Be besimcha."
Yeah. And, but what Henry is saying is that when in 78 the Rebbe had that heart attack, and we were all in 770 at that time, and obviously the everyone was besides themselves, etc. So the Rebbe sent a message down through Rabbi Groner, through label, that the more happier you'll be, the quicker I'm going to get better. So the Rebbe wanted Simchas Torah, the mitzvah is to be happy, and therefore being happy is what's going to achieve the result.
Simple parts get
Huh? Yeah. There's a famous story with the rabbi of Amsterdam, who I can't remember his name anymore. And what happened was that it was the middle of Sudas Purim, and the dikes broke, and the place was getting flooded. And the queen, who was very close to the chief rabbi, whose name again I've forgotten right now, she sent a message to him through her messages saying that that they should all pray. And the messages come, and they see that the rabbi, who already knows about this this thing, it's Purim, and he's dancing, and the Chassidim are clapping, and they're drinking, etc., etc. And she, when she hears what the messages say, she feels betrayed, right? So she summons in the rabbi the next day, and she asks the rabbi, "What are you doing? I thought you cared about our country. You're a good citizen." She says, "This isn't the way we get Hashem to do is what we want him to do, is by fulfilling what he wants us to do." And since on Purim, the mitzvah of Purim is to rejoice, it's dafka through joy that we're going to achieve the end. And that's essentially what the Rebbe was saying in Simchas Torah too. You want me to get better, then you have to fulfill the mitzvah of V'samach b'chagecha, which on Simchas Torah is more so than any other. So we can achieve the same thing through different ends. Okay.
Can I just say, compare this.
Sure.
Davening with great joy is difficult, that's true. But compare that to, I'm a worm, I'm so low, I'm so terrible, Hashem, forgive me, I'll accept your punishment. Like that's also hard.
Okay. Well, the reason why we think that, Shoshana, I believe, is because we, Baruch Hashem, we have been zeicher to hear lots and lots of chassidus. This is not necessarily the attitude of many
That's
people
what I'm
out
saying,
there.
Yeah.
This is a transformational attitude which chassidus brought.
Exactly.
This is not the this is not the average attitude. It's
You're
not
so
the
drained after that. Like, you
Although
don't
you
want to do
could be a
anything. It
worm
kills your
before.
motivation.
It almost, seems to modify because
It's the snakes, the candy snakes, they're visible.
if Tshuva's about repairing the relationship,
You know, the
you're
story
sure
of the
going
worm
to
that goes
repair the
through the
relationship a lot more by being
the
joyful
caterpillar?
and connected to God rather than being a miserable wretch because you're fasting.
that's true, and that's how we would look at it. I'm going to explain this better next week.
Yeah, your husband doesn't have his dinner. He's pretty grumpy.
Tshuva's about
No.
repairing the relationship. You're going to achieve it a lot more by davening a simple and joy because you're connecting Hashem than torturing.
I would argue.
Relationship. You're not
I would argue that that's how we've been conditioned through chassidus to think that way. Okay, I think that's true.
Yeah, a mind is
Yeah,
Baruch Hashem.
Okay, so okay. So why is Stocker so important? So, and why does Stocker take the place of fasting? Right? Well, how does Stocker work? Why does it take the place of fasting? So, first of all, this is, I'm going to speak more about this in Mitzvah Hashem next week, but the Igeres HaTeshuva we're learning is the final version of Igeres HaTeshuva. Okay? Now, the whole of Tanya, including Igeres HaTeshuva, was already learned by Chassidim before it was published by the Alter Rebbe in book form. It went out in manuscript form, okay? We actually have the original manuscript of Igeres HaTeshuva, the first version. Now, I'm going to explain next time, not this time because we won't have time for it, that the first version of Igeres HaTeshuva is fundamentally different than the second version in certain elements. When I say fundamentally, I don't mean it's a totality, but in certain elements it's fundamentally different, okay? But nevertheless, the Rebbe wanted that the first version should be published, and he said one of the reasons for that is because if by comparing the two, you'll understand better aspects of the second version. And also, there are certain things which are written in the first version which the Alter Rebbe left out because they were commentaries rather than essential. So again, I'm going to explain some of that next week because I think it's a very interesting topic in itself and something which is very informing about the whole idea of Torah, generally speaking, why there are two versions and why there's such a fundamental difference between the second one and the first one. But one of the things he says in the second version, which is just a simple thing, he quotes and he says, why Stocker, because there too he says that Stocker takes the place of fasting. And he says, why is Stocker more important than fasting? He says, because, well, the whole purpose of fasting is that it takes the place of the korban. But if you look at and you see what the prophets are constantly railing against in Tanakh is that people are bringing korbanis and they're not ethical people. And the prophets are constantly saying, and we find this in the book of Proverbs, for example, that asay tzedakah or mishpat, doing tzedakah and acting appropriately, nivchel Hashem mizevach, is more chosen by Hashem than bringing a sacrifice. In other words, if you want to bring a real sacrifice, be a charitable person, be a good person, be a decent person. That's the greatest sacrifice you can do. In the first part of Tanya, that's just one little line. I'm just quoting from the first version. But in this version of Tanya, in the first section of Tanya, he speaks about the importance of giving tzedakah and why tzedakah is so important. So he says as follows: that when you brought a korban, for example, right? You brought an animal korban, and what was the purpose of korban? One of the ideas, according to Kabbalah, is that as a result of sacrificing the sheep, you're elevating the sheep and you're taking the sheep and bringing it onto a higher level, okay? And the whole purpose of this world is to take this world and to make the world higher. So, therefore, in the korban, there's different elements. You have to bring, for example, salt, which is daimon, which is inanimate, right? You have to bring vegetation, right? There was always a mincha offering. The mincha offering was, from
Wheat, barley.
wheat, barley. You had to bring the animal, and then you had to bring yourself, right? You had to have the right kavanah. So you were actually elevating the Damer, Somer, Chai, and Medaber. Okay, so if we understand that the whole idea of bringing a sacrifice is elevation, so then what happens when a person's actually giving tzedakah? You're taking money, right? And what you're doing with the money is you're using it for a holy purpose. Okay? All right. But you're only giving a little bit of money. The rest of you stays the same. Well, the rest of your money is still the same. So this particular money, you're elevated. What about the rest of your money? What about the rest of your possessions? So the Alter Rebbe says like this. He says, just like in the case of a korban, by bringing one sheep, one little shepsela, you elevate all of the sheep kingdom. By bringing one ram, you elevate the whole of the ram, whatever it is, ram kingdom. Ram's a big sheep, isn't it? Yeah, okay, whatever. But you get the idea. So similarly also, by giving a certain amount of tzedakah, you elevate all of your money, right? The thing is, however, that you have to be able to give tzedakah in a manner that's going to make a difference. Well, so how do you give tzedakah in a way of difference? Well, some people, everything they give is a major sacrifice, right? Okay. Other people, it's not the biggest sacrifice in the world, but the reality is they could have used this money for things that they wanted to use it for, the Alter Rebbe says. You could have come along and bought yourself more pleasurable things. Instead of using it to become fatter by eating an extra bowl of ice cream, for example, you're taking the money and you're giving it to God, which is a way, so to speak, of taking your fat and your blood and giving that to God. We said that was the idea behind the sacrifice, giving your fat, the blood and the fat, which you're supposed to be kind of, doing this catharsis yourself. It's the idea between fasting, and it's also the idea in tzedakah. You're taking something which you could use for something pleasurable, and instead of that, you're giving it to God. So then you're going to be a little bit deprived of one pleasurable thing. That's why tzedakah actually works. Okay. Now, just a couple of minutes, because I know it's late, and maybe we won't finish today. I just want to explain one thing. So the Rebbe says, hold on. The Rebbe says, so what we've done is we have explained that why tzedakah works today. And we're going to explain more about that now in a moment, or next week. But what happens if you can't give as much tzedakah as you're supposed to? Because next week we're going to learn that the amount of tzedakah that's being asked is quite significant. So we said, for example, we just said that for being angry, you have to give 254 fast days. Well, you know what? 254 is, how much is that? How much tzedakah do you have to give a day? So he says 18 gedei lepelnish. Well, what's that mean? Well, we know what it means. We know very much how much that means in today's currency, because the value, we work it out according to the value of silver. and silver has got a pretty fixed value. I'll just tell you what it is today, without telling you the whole calculation. I looked it up today in the morning. It's approximately $14.50 Australian, 14.50 for every day of fasting. So if you have to fast 254 fast days, you're talking about something like, almost, what is it, 254 multiplied by, something like $2,800 or whatever, right? Okay. However, soon the Alter Rebbe is going to say is that really that's not enough. You should be giving it according to however many times you got angry. Well, you might become pauperized. If, for example, you got angry 10 times, you have going to be anyway. It could end up being a horrendous amount of money, and that's only for one sin. What about the time you weren't careful about Shabbos? What about the time you spoke a little bit of Lashon Hara? What about this? What about that? You're going to be giving huge amounts of tzedakah. Huge amounts of tzedakah.
If you're married and have a family, you're going to be depriving your family of lots, and that's going to cause even bigger problems.
Right. Okay. So now, what happens if you can't? Not only you can't fast, but you can't give all of this tzedakah which is required either. It's also not working. So what do you do then? So I'm just telling you briefly now. So the Rebbe explains like this. The Rebbe says that it says the Chassidus, and we know the Gemara says, that what happens if Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos? Can you blow shofar? No, you can't blow shofar. Okay? Well, what do? You can't blow shofar. So it says the Chassidus that by Shabbos itself makes up for the mitzvah of blowing shofar. It didn't before. But once Chazal come along and tell us that you can't blow shofar, whatever was achieved by shofar is now achieved by Shabbos. Except that you also have to read the psukim. The psukim, Malchus, Chredis, and Shofar, and by reading those, you actually make up for it. So the Rebbe says the same thing also applies here. I'm telling you briefly, it's all Sikh of the Rebbe, very briefly. You're supposed to be fasting, or alternatively, you're supposed to be giving tzedakah. But you can't. It's just too much. It's overwhelming. So what do? You can't say that you don't have the effect. Like the Rebbe explains, Hashem never deprives us. And if we can't do something one way, it's going to be achieved some other way anyway. The Baruchni, if our Rebbeim tell us not to do it, it doesn't mean to say it's not done. It's going to be achieved some other way. And the Rebbe says, well, how could it be achieved? So the Rebbe says, what happens if you can't bring a korban today and you're supposed to bring a korban? What are you supposed to do? So the Gemara says, read about the korbanis. That's why in the beginning of davening, we have to read a whole lot of stuff about korbanis, right? What are you reading all this stuff about? Because reading about the korban is equal to bringing the korban. So the Rebbe says over here too, reading what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, if we read it and understand it, and I think also what Mr. Lecha said before, that we understand as a result of it the extent of what the sin is, all of a sudden that kind of reading takes the place of the fast itself. That's what the Rebbe says. And our Rebbes were manhigi ader, they were leaders of a generation, they enlightened us. And when the Rebbe is saying, he's not saying a pshet like a rabbi says a pshet in shul, was a rabbi, can knock rabbis, right? He's saying something which actually happens. And that is that by reading this thing, by reading what we're reading now, of course it's important. Because by reading about it, you achieve it. Just like by reading about a korban, you achieve it. So this appeasement to Hashem, it's a wonderful thing, can happen as a result of reading about tshuva and reading about what we should be doing, although we're not allowed to do that thing anymore. The effect is still going to be the same. And the Rebbe emphasizes the effect is still going to be the same. Of course, one has to give tzedakah, no question about it. But you don't have to get overwhelmed by it because there is an alternative. And this is what we said now. Okay? Now, what I'm going to try to do before Shabbos is, and hopefully today, I think the best way of learning, as we all know, is by teaching. So I'm going to try to just kind of summarize what we learned this week and send out a bit of a synopsis. And then if you choose to, maybe you can share it with your families on Shabbos, etc. again, by teaching, you consolidate your own learning. Good Shabbos.
The children, the girls, they love the story about the wood and the nails. With the kids, I shared that.
Right.
About how that whole thing, like, you know, being like respectful to adults, and if you're not, some of the marks still stay. About the little boy with the nails, they just love that.
Right.
It's something that they can
Relate to, of course.
Yeah.
I met somebody in the bakery and she said those
Yeah.
YouTube videos with her Blackie are
Yes.
amazing. She
Yeah, someone on Shabbos, what's the name was watching it?
myself just
Yeah. Okay. Good Shabbos.